Of the 20 countries most vulnerable to climate change, the majority are at war. This means people are facing a double threat.
Tu vois, quand 100 personnes vont vouloir se partager ce qui suffisait à 5 personnes, ça ne peut pas aller. Soit tout le monde part, ou bien tous les gens s'entretuent. Ça va être ça. Tout est parti de la sécheresse là qu'il y a.
بالعراق درجات الحرارة دا ترتفع والجو صار كلش حار، المطر أقل والحرب خلت مينا ملوث وقاعنا متدمرة.
This double threat of climate change and war pushes people out of their homes, breaks food and supply chains, amplifies diseases, and weakens healthcare services. By 2050, the need for humanitarian aid is expected to double if urgent steps are not taken. We cannot let this happen. Climate funding and action must reach people in conflict zones. Climate change affects us all. But those living with this double threat can't be left to face it alone.
A short introduction to the next topic by our colleagues at the International Committee of the Red Cross, who's also working a lot on exactly this intersection that we're about to address. Gregory Matthews, welcome. You are Deputy Regional Director, Asia, International Rescue Committee. Welcome. And we have Johanna Malm. You are Head of Research at the Swedish Folke Bernadotteakademin. And I also have Catalina Jamie. Good morning, Catalina.
Good morning, everyone.
Joining us from Colombia. So early morning for Catalina. So from our climate and conflict, head of climate and conflict at our own climate center. Sorry. Okay. So that introduction with those films gave us a short summary, but I think I will address you first, Gregory. Listening to this first section where we had Ranjan very vividly talking about the effects on the people that he and the Red Cross volunteers meet, you work in this region regionally, so to say. And I know that the Rescue Committee really places itself in the intersection here of climate and conflict. Right. Can you just give us shortly why it is important to address these two in conjunction?
Thank you. Good afternoon. I think the videos did a pretty good job. Yeah. I mean, just to maybe put a bit of a finer point on what the kind of the key message from the video is I mean, I think kind of in the where we are right now at a point in history where globally we have more armed conflict happening in the world right now than we have in modern history. Those conflicts are generating more refugees and displaced people than we've ever seen since World War II right now. I just saw a statistic, 120 million people are now displaced, either within their countries or across international borders into neighboring countries. The geography of where these armed conflicts are happening and the geography of climate vulnerability are strikingly similar. Depending on which index you're looking at, 60 to 70% of the armed conflicts in the world are also locations where there is the biggest climate change risk is also present. So we've got kind of two Venn diagrams which are almost completely encircling each other. Conflict, climate overlap quite strongly and creates really substantial intersectional impacts and needs on different populations in those locations. And it doesn't just affect the places where we see conflict. It is also happening in the neighboring countries where people are being displaced too. We had the great example of Pakistan talking about the floods situation. What we saw also in Pakistan in 2022, 2023, there was flooding, massive catastrophic flooding, which also coincided with a substantial refugee movement from Afghanistan into Pakistan in 2021 to 2023, same times as floods were happening. Also, just before the floods happened, there was a change in government in Pakistan, not an entirely peaceful change of government in Pakistan. So you see this convergence happening time and time and time again of conflict, displacement, and then the stresses that that puts on economic systems, on political systems, on social systems, which drive and exacerbate climate vulnerability. And so there's this really dynamic interplay that's happening, a vicious cycle between conflict and climate impacts. We see on one hand, conflict is driving climate change. We see natural resource extraction to fund conflict. We see destruction of our resilient systems in country. Health systems are mentioned here. You see communities are being torn apart. Social cohesion is really ripped apart in conflict settings. On the other hand, you see how climate change is driving competition for natural resources. It's driving mobility of populations. And it is really stressing the kind of the social, economic, and political factors which give rise to conflict. So it's overall a very vicious cycle that we're locked in across a broad swath of the world today.
And I will soon ask you for a few examples of specific countries. We've already touched upon Pakistan, for instance. You are doing research on the eastern part of Congo. How does this broader picture that Gregory is painting here look like in that context?
Yes, of course, it resonates with what you're saying. I think, of course, Eastern Congo not being your poster child of climate change, we don't talk about Congo as a very climate change affected area, but actually Eastern Congo is affected, but in a different way. We clearly see, irregular rainfall, increasing temperatures, a lot of erosion because of the presence of many armed actors and livelihood challenges. And of course, that with a lot of landslides also that affect vulnerable populations. But the thing that I want to bring to all of our attention to talk about is gender in this context. And I really think this is, of course, the research project that I lead is looks at how gender relations condition lived experiences of climate insecurity, and it really does. It's not just looking at the impact on women. It's about, I think, and this is what I really want to highlight, is not just women. It's also about men. It's about masculinities. It's about how climate change, especially if you're looking in conflict-affected areas, how that affects your ability to be a man as it has been defined in the context. Oftentimes when livelihoods change, you turn to destructive coping mechanisms, and I could speak forever, of course, about this research project, but the bottom line is, and we're seeing this not just in Congo, of course, in all contexts, is that masculinities and femininities change in this and in this situation, in all situations, because they're ever changing. But as the climate changes, this really is something to keep in mind when programming. We need to understand this, and we also need to understand how the systemic inequalities of societies that we work in when we program, because otherwise we risk actually reinforcing the issues, or if we don't understand the gendered situation, we risk reinforcing the issues that are there and that are aggravated sometimes by climate change in conflict-affected areas. And we see this clearly in Congo, but elsewhere as well, yeah.
Yeah. I think I'm going to ask you to add there, Catalina, because one thing of many that our Climate Center does is help our own movement to do better programming, better work with people. And we have that part of our movement called the International Committee of the Red Cross, which is really the part of us that work in conflicts, right? And they've, I'm looking at you at both voices, they have really taken this to heart in what Johanna is mentioning, and how do we need to then change how we work because of this. Could you talk a bit about how the Climate Center and the ICRC is working in this intersection?
Yes, yeah. So lovely to be with all of you. For me, I mean, it's quite special to be like talking about this in Sweden from Colombia, because I actually, when I started to work on this topic, I studied in Uppsala University, and it was like around 15 years ago when I started to look at this intersection between climate and conflict. So it's just really wonderful to see how the Swedish Red Cross and many of you are really interested in like how can we move this topic and change really the way how we're doing climate action in this particular context. For the Climate Center, has been very special over the last 5 years to being able to work with the International Committee of the Red Cross on helping them to integrate climate risk within all their operations. So as you probably know, the ICRC has like a very clear focus on supporting people affected by conflict. They have very clear programming, but like different type of assistance and protection work. But climate, or in a way, disaster risk reduction, was not really part of their programming. It was not really considered as like an additional element that could affect the communities that they support. But 5 years ago, there was a big recognition of the institution, like saying, well, I think things have to change. Like we are responding as an institution to different floods in coordination with the national societies and the federation. They see clearly that the areas that they reach because of the particular status that they have are being impacted. So they decided to have a massive radical change within the institution to think like what climate means to them, what it means for their operations. So the work that we do with all the operations of the ICRC globally is to start to think what are the different like climate hazards that might impact their programming and at what extent and how they need to change their programs, and how within their existing ways of working, they could add elements of adaptation, of risk reduction within what they do. And they have like absolutely brilliant examples. For example, something that happened this year in the Sahel, where there was a very terrible heat wave, and population in detention in Mali, who you probably are aware, but detention centers that are made for like 400 people have more or less 4,000 people. Like it's like the level of people in one single place is really, really big. So of course, if you add that a heat wave, I mean, it's a humanitarian situation. So the ICRC has been looking into how they can use weather forecasts to be able to anticipate that crisis, to be able to support the jail population and the government to make sure that the inmates wouldn't die because of the heat wave. So it's a very niche particular example. And together with that, there are many, many other examples of like how the ICRC is really supporting population affected by conflict. And I mean, all this to say that this is not only, I mean, it is an important role for the ICRC, but it's definitely a role for the entire humanitarian sector. And there is so much still to be done because the gaps are quite big.
I think it's a very concrete example, and this is also an institution, part of our movement, but with a very specific mandate that can reach parts of populations that very few others can. Do you have more examples of this intersection, but also where we can actually do things? Because I think it's also it gives us hope that there is actually something that we can do and change. Do you have more examples from the Rescue Committee?
Sure, there's a lot of examples. I think I can tell a story from the Philippines. So before I do, I think a big part of when we're talking about kind of climate and addressing climate risks and supporting climate adaptation in conflict settings, we are very much talking about also governance and strengthening governance systems and supporting good governance. And I think a great example of this comes from the Philippines, which is often held up as, you know, a great example of strong disaster preparedness. One of the most climate at-risk countries in the world. They have good government systems, strong institutions, which is true for most of the country. But it is particularly if we're talking about the Bangsamoro Autonomous Region in Muslim Mindanao, which is the third most conflict-affected area in Asia, aside from Afghanistan and Myanmar, Philippines is the most conflict-affected country, particularly from this one little, geographically quite small region of Mindanao, which is kind of a separatist in nature. There has an autonomous government was just approved and came into effect in 2019, just before the COVID-19 pandemic. And this is a new government stood up from scratch. You know, the military generals and fighters took off their uniforms, stepped into political office, and had to stand up a disaster response ministry, had to stand up all kind of branches and institutions of government. The Harvard Humanitarian Initiative just did an analysis of awareness of climate change and climate impacts. Super high across all of Philippines. Everybody was aware of climate change, knows how to do it, how to respond. For BARM, this autonomous region, at baseline, which they conducted in 2020, was almost zero. They went back and did late last year, or maybe earlier this year, they did a follow-up study on that. And the levels of awareness have skyrocketed. Still quite a bit lower in BARM than the rest of the Philippines, but there's been a substantial change. And so with that has come huge levels of engagement with this autonomous regional government that was set up. My organization, the IRC, and many other organizations have been very active in supporting communities, municipalities in particular, where there are hugely gender dynamics at play. It's a really conservative Muslim society, and their understanding of how to respond to emergencies and how to prepare for emergencies is very much from a a defense perspective, a military perspective. So we take people, we move them. It's not taking into account the fact that, well, who are you actually moving? It's mostly men that you're moving. The male interactions with women are really restricted. And so it took understanding and a lot of capacity building and training and working with the municipalities to think about how they are structuring their planning. Who are they hiring in? And so hiring in a disaster response coordinator. Wow, well, you can access federal funds to do that from Manila, actually, from the central government. They will fund municipalities to hire these positions. So it's bringing them along into the planning process and the resources that are available within the country. And then who did they decide to hire? Well, the municipalities that we worked with hired women. And they didn't hire women who were the sister of the mayor, but they did really strong competency-based recruitment to bring people in. And then they said, well, we need some help. How do we talk to women in the community? And so we supported them in kind of community mobilization. And so based on this, they formed a multi-year action plan. They set up women's rescue brigades. They did community events. And a part of this was also working with kind of reducing conflict protection risks from armed violence that was still continuing within the communities. And so they had quite a bit of work then around, okay, how do we work with demilitarized youth? And how do we get them back into school? And so it became a very almost a feminist approach that was adopted by the communities, built into multi-year planning, and which they ended up getting funded through public resources. So little injections of technical capacity, little injections of some resources and funding to support some of the community mobilization efforts, then linking with the systems that are available to them, is the type of support that's really available to help recover and kind of strengthen some of the governance structures in a place like the Philippines, where you have these pockets of weak governance that's not connected with the big capacity that's available within the country. That's a little bit different from places like Afghanistan or Myanmar, but I think it's a good example of ways that we can be inserting ourselves to be injecting technical capacity that makes a big change.
Let's come back to the issue of governance also when we're looking at, for instance, the Eastern Congo, because here we have one example, and I think it's a very different examples there, for instance. And we've been talking about this discussion of broader development, building resilience more broadly. But if we're looking at specifically this intersection, we've also done a study, the ICRC did a study, I think together with the Norwegian Red Cross, looking at how this climate financing that exists has a very hard time trickling its way all the way down to the people affected. Do you want to comment on that specifically, Catalina? Because I know that you've been looking at that as well. And I know there was a declaration, and help me here, at the last COP looking specifically at this. Could you speak a bit to that?
Yes. One of the most fundamental challenges that we are facing to be able to bring climate action to conflict-affected contexts is the lack of climate finances reaching those places. So that's we have it very clear. Actually, during the IPCC 6 assessment report process, we try to identify the evidence of at what extent adaptation was actually happening in conflict context and how were the founding flows. And we did one of the biggest analyses ever done on this topic. And it was a process where the Climate Center was very active. I was one of the contributor authors. And it was just that first moment where we kind of had that big realization. So the gap is there. We need to show it in the report. And from that moment, that had served to really kind of move a little bit the discussion, particularly at that policy level, to say, well, I mean, there is a gap. We need to do something urgently. So through that process, something very important was created, something called the Coalition for Climate Action in Conflict Context, which is a group that has been led by the ICRC with the World Bank, Mercy Corps, many other organizations. And that process, and I'm so excited because it's just so fascinating to see something that comes from an idea of a group of people that really gets to something that has such a big political momentum. So a lot of that work that we have done through this coalition has led to this COP28 declaration that is the Climate Relief, Recovery and Peace Declaration, that has basically the important point is to say, we need to make a commitment to change the way how climate finances dynamics are basically change the status quo to make sure that the way of working in conflict settings towards climate action changes. And it's a process that has got a lot of traction. It was so many signatories, governments, organizations, and we're in this moment working on a coordination mechanism for the implementation. So there's a big kind of political and also practical process behind this. However, if we look into reality, still there is a gigantic gap. There is really urgent need to change the way the financing system for adaptation and risk reduction needs to be kind of fit for purpose in this context. So I think in terms of there is definitely a lot of progress compared to what we had 4 years ago, 3 years ago, but yet it is not translated into practice. It is not really making the big shifts that need to happen. But we do have the hope, but also the solutions at hand to be able to do it. I think it's just a matter of this big political commitment of donors and countries and organizations to just continue putting this as a priority.
But for me, as a person who doesn't, I'm head of comms. I don't work with these issues on a policy level from day to day. What we're talking about here is, just so that I get my head around it, the need for having specifically climate adaptation and climate funding reaching these very like groups that are very in a super affected setting. But then at the same time, we're talking about we need to build broader resilience and work on governance more broadly. Are we asking for both, or where do we put our emphasis? Because this was really an emphasis on this specifically at the COP, looking at this very targeted in a way. And then we're saying, but for instance, in many of these settings, and as you said, there was even public financing. We didn't even have to go to these bigger institutional financing. Do you get where I'm grasping from? And would you like to comment, Johanna?
I think, I mean, it's wonderful to hear like the story leading up to this declaration and the work that's been done to make climate financing available and more in conflict-affected areas. We know that there's climate funding. Then there's in conflict-affected countries there's less, and then in very conflict-affected countries there's even less. So this is an issue. But I think it's also important not to think that climate financing earmarked as such is the only way, because as you're saying, and this, like now I'm deep into the specific context of South Kivu in Eastern Congo. Anything that you would do that would strengthen gender equality, or that would strengthen community resilience, or anything just to solve like conflicts between herders and farmers, will help in building climate adaptation, because these are the things that intersect. So I think it's just development work, or even like humanitarian work that is done in a that where we do no gendered harm way. I mean, these things that we all try and do. This also helps, because this is not something that is climate insecurity isn't isolated from all the other insecurities that we face. So it's a kind of continuum. But then, of course, it would help if more of that funding would be available to severely conflict-affected areas. But because that's a long way to go with all the risk assessments and all the risk aversion in the financial institutions, I think it's useful to think about it in a broader perspective, to think about everything that we do as helping, actually. Even if you don't think, I mean, it's good, it's important to integrate climate concerns into peace building. But even if you do peace building work or gender equality work or anything, it's going to help. I think that, to take a broader picture is really helpful.
Talking about risk aversion, and I will give you all the opportunity to, but I'm thinking of another context then, like Afghanistan. And again, like financing in Afghanistan, climate funding or broader funding, governance funding, an extreme context again. And I know that you work with Afghanistan. How do you intersect these in that context? And I'm sorry if you were preparing to say something completely different. Please do that.
I think we have a responsibility as well of bridging this gap between, what happens in a declaration in COP28, for example, with what are the communities asking for and demanding on the ground. And I think we have a responsibility to try to marry those. I think there's a huge role to play for civil society and strengthening civil society, particularly civil society from the areas most impacted by climate change. There are large-scale networks of civil society organizations that really, I think, can be empowered and lifted to be holding duty bearers to account. That there are representatives from countries that are making decisions about how climate financing is used within their borders. They need to be hearing from communities. They need to be hearing the voices of people that are affected. They need to be kind of held to the fire for what's happening. The regional policymakers, anybody that is engaging in these climate financing decision making, there needs to be greater voice and participation and engagement from the affected communities and those that represent them. In terms of Afghanistan, Afghanistan is also one of the most intensely conflict affected, but intensely climate affected as well. It's hugely dependent on rain-fed agriculture, on snowpack in the Hindu Kush to be kind of irrigating the entire country, and when that doesn't happen, the food security situation just becomes untenable, as we're seeing now, which is humanitarian assistance is absolutely critical for addressing those changes, to mitigate how terrible the food security situation could be. Just this year, there was projections that the parts of the country would be slipping into to famine. We haven't seen that. That hasn't realized, and that is attributed to large part to the levels of humanitarian assistance that had been going into the country. So I think in the Afghanistan context, we cannot step away from humanitarian assistance. That needs to be there. It also needs to be matched with development assistance that's going to help support adaptation strategies, that's going to be supporting innovations in the Afghanistan context in agricultural development, for example, which aren't necessarily innovations for the rest of the world. I mean, a lot of the things that could be the adaptations that could be enabling Afghan farmers, both men and women, to be more resilient and better adapted to the climate effects, are things that most farmers and agricultural producers do everywhere else in the world. It's good extension services, drip irrigation, like little changes like that are the types of solutions that aren't there, that need to be there. We can have a big effect just by rolling out and the things that we know work already across other parts of the world, but haven't made it because of because of the conflict. But now there is a greater degree of access. We have more space to be able to go and to engage, even though it's exceptionally challenging and difficult. There is a demand, and communities are asking for this. They are asking for that support. And that gives us the opening to be able to work in a context like Afghanistan to be delivering these types of services and support.
Catalina, do you want to comment on my question before I force Gregory to jump into Afghanistan as well, on the bridging or if you agree on our responsibility of bridging these two, focusing specifically on climate financing versus this broader development governance perspective of funding local communities? Because please do, if so. Otherwise, I also had a question on you after that, but I see you want to comment, so please do.
Yes, I love to comment on that because I think the two speakers mentioned something really important. I think the dimension of the complex crisis that we have, is so big that it's just not like one single solution, will get us there. We need all these different strategies from different angles to be able to support the populations that are at the end, on the front line of impacts. And I think I really like what you said, that, through a lot of gender empowerment and things that we wouldn't necessarily call adaptation. Yes, that is risk reduction. That is absolutely 100% risk reduction. And we also need to look at these at different levels. When we talk about investment, part of it, climate finance, is not just at one particular layer, but definitely from the governance, big changes, institutional elements that need to happen, to all the different layers that go down to the community level. Something that is very clear, and where I see one of the big gaps, and this is through a lot of the research that I'm doing, particularly on anticipatory action in conflict settings, is that, and I think it reinforces the point of my previous speaker, that at the end, that strengthening of communities, it's the key. At the end, the people that is at the forefront of responding to the crisis, of being able to reduce risk, it's the most important, because they are there, and particularly in a conflict context, which is very difficult. You need to, is the people that is there in the conflict areas that knows very well the dynamics of who is who, the power dynamics of what can be done, what cannot be done, what is dangerous, what is not dangerous. So it can strengthen all these individuals and communities that will be able actually to take the actions across all the time scale, from the long term interventions, to the more kind of preparedness part, but also to the response. And I think this to what you were saying before, we know, and I think Freddie later will come to this. I mean, the dimension of the events that we are seeing, for more that we want to do, adaptation and risk reduction and do the investments, it is likely that we're going to see very big impacts. So strengthening those response systems is essential. Like, we need to continue strengthening the humanitarian system to be able to respond in the most dignified way at the scales that we might not have seen before, or we're starting actually to see. So yeah, so that complements a little bit what the other speakers were saying.
I know in this respect that you, and correct me if I'm wrong, the Climate Center and a few other national societies of the Red Cross movement is working on an actual very hands-on handbook when it comes to climate adaptation and how that can be done in complex or conflict settings. Could you give an example of what that specifically would look like? And I'm thinking quite hands-on. You're talking about working with communities. What is it that we then do? Ranjan mentioned earlier in Bangladesh how they work very hands-on with communities. What is it that's different than in a conflict setting to what he might have mentioned?
Yeah, so I think that you raised this point because a couple of years ago, with different movement partners, we started to think, well, we're talking about reaching people affected by conflict. We know that we have a lot of examples within the movement and outside of the movement of what is happening. But we know that practitioners, particularly like new people that is entering into the field, of persons that have done in the past disaster risk reduction or climate adaptation, but not necessarily in very complex settings, might need some extra like tools and ideas and inspiration to be able to do it. So an incredible process, and many of you that work with the movement here, you know how complicated it is to do a movement document, something that is with the IFRC, the ICRC, German Red Cross, many national societies, and the Climate Center included. We managed to actually develop something all together that talks about this, like how can we support practitioners to do better and scale disaster risk reduction in conflict settings. So we will launch this very soon at the General Assembly in Geneva, which is very, very exciting. So looking into the concrete examples. So one of the fascinating things is that, of course, we didn't want to just reinvent the wheel, but work with national societies like the Lebanese Red Cross, the Colombian Red Cross, the Bangladesh Red Crescent, South Sudan Red Cross, and many others to kind of capture a lot of the learnings of like how they have been managed to do a lot of community-based disaster risk reduction projects. And that is small, because that's one of the issues. Like, a lot of those projects are just very niche here and there and not really at the scale that is needed, but trying to learn how they managed to do it and what were the lessons. So this handbook is offering really like a rainbow of all the type of strategies that already exist, from like conflict sensitivity tools and ideas that we use, but we have not necessarily applied to the context of like climate adaptation and risk reduction, bringing together like new ideas of how to integrate context of or concepts of like stress testing, the type of like projects that we develop. Like, will the projects that we implement in particular areas that are extremely complex with so many, not only conflict, but like a multitude of crises happening at the same time, will those projects actually like succeed and will actually have a lasting impact? So there are like a set of like really practical set of tools that are practitioner. Like, our dream is that we're going to have all these different Red Cross volunteers and program managers that are in the field and that will be able to have that handbook, like similar to, of course, building on our beautiful BCA process, and just to have those ideas of like how they will be able to design the projects and implement their projects. So we will make sure that you all will receive a copy of this in October when we launch the guide.
I think it's interesting. We're moving from like very hands-on, how do we do it in a specific setting, all the way up to like our responsibility of trying to make sure that all these processes on a global level actually join hands and pull in the same direction, and quite interesting. I will give you the last word, Johanna, because we have two organizations here working very much hands-on with communities. What would be your, and will be a short one, but what would be your challenge to us, or what would you want to send us looking at academia or perhaps your specific research?
I'd say to consider how gender relations condition lived experiences of climate insecurity. Because that is very, I've been, and when I read all these policy documents and also making climate adaptation work, I do not see gender. It's there. You talk about vulnerable populations. Some of these documents, I search them systematically. I don't see women. I don't see woman. Like you do search for the plural and the singular and gender, you don't see it. And I think it's a missed opportunity because this is going to change how well we can make the programmatic work for beneficiaries that really need it, because this is a gendered phenomenon.
Thank you all, and thank you for those ending words. And I think we can bring that into our discussion also on the national level, domestic level, that we will be addressing after a break. Before that, we have one more keynote speaker. I will say thank you so much, and especially Catalina for getting up. I don't know what time it is, 5 in the morning. So thank you so much.
It's all good. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.